Iran believed it could halt US and Israeli attacks in the Middle East using its only trump card, closing the Strait of Hormuz and attacking ships passing through it.
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. From now on, no ship in every type is not allowed to pass from the Strait of Hormuz till next notice.
However, this historic mistake by Tehran resulted in it paying a very heavy price, because threatening the strait was pointless while massive floating military fortresses like the Abraham Lincoln and Gerald Ford were present in the region. The brutal retaliatory strike launched by the US led to the greatest destruction in the history of the Iranian Navy. What if we told you that the near total obliteration of the Iranian Navy is merely the tip of the iceberg? What could be worse for a country whose Navy is 95% rendered inoperable? We know this sounds quite shocking, but there is an even more striking aspect to this devastating situation. The Iranian ships that survived the US's heavy bombardment of Iranian ports and vessels were left with no choice but to take a desperate course of action. The image of the remaining Navy was completely shattered in international waters by this move. The most critical factor leading to this situation was that Iran's territorial waters were no longer a safe haven for its ships. That is why dozens of surviving Iranian ships, corvettes, and small boats found their only option in fleeing to the open ocean. They set out on a desperate journey to seek refuge in countries thousands of kilometers away. Their route, however, was quite striking. Iranian ships fleeing Tomahawk missiles and B-52 bombings were heading south across the Indian Ocean. Among them were the most critical iron behemoths Iran would deploy to threaten the Strait of Hormuz: Iris Dina, Iris Levan, and Iris Bushehr. All three ships were returning from the Milan 2026 exercise. These naval assets had departed from the port of Visakhapatnam, India, and were heading towards Sri Lanka. The US Navy, however, had actually been tracking these ships in international waters from the very beginning. In other words, the ships' routes and destinations had been calculated in advance. In particular, the story of the Iris Dina's escape served as the clearest example of the situation. After departing from Visakhapatnam, this ship headed south across the Indian Ocean toward the southern coast of Sri Lanka. The route was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 nautical miles southwest from the Bay of Bengal through international waters. The ship was on its way back to Iran, but accelerated upon noticing the US surveillance. Later, the Iris Dina was struck off the coast of Sri Lanka and failed to reach its destination. The ship was torpedoed by a US submarine on March 4, 2026. This was the first torpedo strike since World War II. Another ship attempting to evade the US Navy, the Iris Levan, was on a similar route. The ship was heading toward India's southern coast, but changed course under the pretext of a technical malfunction. The landing ship, Iris Levan, barely made it to the port of Kochi, India. The ship's 183 crew members were forcibly housed at nearby naval facilities. The Iris Bushehr, which followed the Iris Levan and was trying to escape heavy attacks, shared the same fate. This fleet replenishment ship sought refuge in the port of Colombo, Sri Lanka, but was detained. Neither ship was able to complete their escape plans. Do you think these dramatic capture moments halted the Iranian ship's escape operations? Surprisingly, no. The ships continued to change course due to US attacks. Most ships fled from Bandar Abbas and Chabahar, heading toward the Indian Ocean or the waters off Pakistan. However, the US struck more than 60 ships. Faced with a shocking toll, the Iranian Navy realized it was completely trapped in the Indian Ocean. Following this heavy loss, the remaining ships either hid in ports or fled in small boats. Some ships attempted to blend in with the so-called shadow fleet, which is alleged to smuggle oil from Iran to China. These ships headed toward Pakistan or Oman, but the picture remained the same. Dozens of ships were neutralized before reaching their intended destinations. This tale of escape was the clearest evidence of how the Iranian Navy's prestige had vanished from the world stage. A power that had defied the world by closing its own strait had vanished in just a few days. The US hunting down these ships in the middle of the ocean, however, sent a very clear message regarding the global balance of power. Washington was proclaiming that control of the oceans was entirely in its hands. It was emphasized that not a single hiding place would be left for any hostile element. Thus, Iran's dream of conducting operations beyond the oceans was buried in the depths forever. Plans to reach its allies by sea have come to a complete end. So, what was the reason behind the massive US operations that drove the Iranian Navy to flee its own waters and venture out into the oceans? Here, we must first look at the ruthless moves made by the Tehran regime after it closed the Strait of Hormuz. In this strategic strait, a narrow 33-kilometer waterway through which approximately 20 million barrels pass daily, the IRGC adopted a terrifying stance. Iran ruthlessly attacked 17 different commercial tankers attempting to pass through. As a result of these attacks, 6 massive tankers were rendered unusable. In other words, Tehran had directed its retaliatory measures at entirely the wrong targets. The civilian tanker Mayuri Nari, flying the Thai flag, became a target of Iranian drones while attempting to pass through the strait. Massive damage formed on the stern of the vessel, just above the waterline, after the crew was evacuated. These damage patterns were the typical signature of explosive-laden unmanned surface vehicles, so-called kamikaze boats. Even a Russian LNG carrier fell into this asymmetric ring of fire. These burning steel hulks in the middle of the sea were massive blows to global energy security. The Iranian regime did not discriminate in creating this chaos. Attacks were even being carried out against ships belonging to Moscow, seen as Tehran's closest ally. The regime was pursuing a completely ruthless strategy in taking this step. Mojtaba Khamenei made his first public statement on March 13th via state television. In this message, he clearly outlined the regime's objectives to the entire world. Khamenei announced that the strait would be used as a tool of pressure against the enemy. He declared in no uncertain terms that this strategic passage would be closed. The remarks by Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, were far more direct and aggressive. Tangsiri declared that ships from the US, Israel, and European countries would absolutely not be granted passage. He issued a clear and unacceptable ultimatum, saying, "If you have any doubts, come and test us." The regime's objective was quite clear. It was to suddenly drive oil prices above the $100 per barrel level. They wanted to send fuel prices soaring at the pumps in Europe and the US. Thus, they planned to trigger unstoppable inflation in the Western world. They intended to drive the citizens of Western countries into an economic crisis. They calculated that this would incite those populations against their own governments. Tehran believed it could win the war not only with missiles, but also through global inflation. Things took a dark turn right at this point. Because Iran's true strength in the Strait of Hormuz lies not in the large warships floating on the ocean. The real threat lies in the asymmetric weapons hidden within the rugged mountains and underground tunnels that dominate the strait. Iran has changed the rules of the game ever since it lost half of its conventional forces in the 1988 clash with the US Navy. Instead of confronting massive American destroyers, the Tehran regime has shifted to an invisible and deadly strategy. It is estimated that massive anti-ship ballistic missiles, like the Qiyam-2 and Khalij-Fars, are stored in caves deep within the mountains. Capable of reaching speeds of Mach 3, these missiles can send a massive oil tanker to the bottom of the ocean in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, Shahed 136 kamikaze drones with a range of thousands of kilometers await launch from underground launch pads. You don't need a fleet worth billions of dollars to cripple a civilian tanker. A swarm of explosive-laden drones costing just a few $100,000 could easily strike the world's largest cargo ship. Consequently, the shallow, island-filled waters around the strait remain rife with traps, from which the Iranian Revolutionary Guards can launch their fast attack boats. Moreover, Iran is not alone in this treacherous siege it is attempting to establish. The Houthis in Yemen are providing support from the Red Sea with Quds and Tufan missiles equipped with Iranian technology. There is, quite literally, a dual strait crisis unfolding, and global trade is under pressure from both directions. Due to this asymmetric threat, the usual daily traffic of 70 to 80 ships through the Strait of Hormuz has been cut off like a knife. Outside the Gulf, over 1,000 commercial ships are waiting helplessly to avoid becoming missile targets. Before the war, an average of 70 to 80 massive cargo ships would safely pass through these waters daily. With the start of operations, this number plummeted almost to zero overnight. Over 1,000 tankers and commercial ships had formed a massive convoy off the Gulf's coast. They were anchored helplessly, waiting for a safe passage corridor to open. Risk premiums for ships passing through the region had skyrocketed to astronomical levels. Still, there were some notable exceptions that managed to navigate through this deadly ring of fire. In particular, Chinese-linked ships were following a completely different strategy in this chaotic environment. The deep economic ties between Beijing and Tehran were changing the dynamics of the situation. These ties provided Chinese ships with a kind of unofficial immunity in the strait. Massive cargo ships like the Iron Maiden and Sino-Ocean made a clever move. Using automatic identification systems, they loudly declared to the world that they were Chinese. This digital shield they established prevented them from becoming targets of rogue missiles. Thus, it ensured that millions of barrels of oil reached China safely. On the other hand, Pakistan, which had to meet its energy needs urgently, devised its own solution. The Pakistani Navy launched a new mission called Operation Muhafiz-ul-Bahr. They began providing armed escorts for their own civilian tankers. However, even they avoided entering the narrow and dangerous waters of the Strait of Hormuz directly. For now, they have limited their operations to the Arabian Sea. Turkey's Minister of Transport and Infrastructure also made a rather critical statement on the matter. He announced to the world that 15 Turkish-owned ships were waiting in the strait to pass through. One of these ships, the Rosanna, achieved a remarkable success story. As a result of sensitive and secret diplomatic negotiations, it managed to pass through the region safely. Thus, it became one of the rare vessels to emerge from this ring of fire. However, the remaining 14 Turkish ships continued to wait anxiously in the region. These exceptional passages actually conveyed a very important message to us. It demonstrated that the Strait of Hormuz was not completely closed. However, it proved that passage was only possible through specific power balances and diplomatic negotiations. As if the pressure Iran was exerting on international oil and cargo ships were not enough, it also took action to turn its maritime areas into what amounted to a minefield. Mining the Strait of Hormuz and its surroundings. This inhumane move carried the potential for a global crisis. However, the US side took action against this threat and succeeded in thwarting Iran's strategy to turn the strait into a high-risk zone through critical maneuvers. A total of 16 mine-laying vessels were specifically targeted and destroyed one by one. The strategic significance of this move by the US military was immense. If those mine-laying ships had been able to complete their covert missions, disaster would have been inevitable. The Strait of Hormuz would have turned into a massive trap that could not be cleared for years. There would have been thousands of explosive mines placed on the seabed. This situation would have made any kind of civilian or military passage completely impossible. Iran planned to turn the strait into a dark and extremely dangerous shadow zone. The US, however, illuminated that shadow and eliminated that deadly threat at its very source. The sinking of the mine-laying ships struck at the very heart of Iran's asymmetric naval warfare doctrine. By the end of the attacks, 95% of the fleet had been reduced to a useless heap of scrap metal. Iran's operational capacity at sea was now effectively non-existent. However, the sinking of the Iranian Navy and its mine-laying ships did not solve all the problems. The US had to ensure the global flow of energy. To do so, it had to implement massive, multi-layered additional protective measures. Because the global economy continued to lose millions of dollars with every passing minute. US President Donald Trump stepped in front of the cameras at this critical juncture. He announced the new rules of the game to the entire world in extremely harsh terms. He declared that they were taking a very firm stance on the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. He emphasized that, if necessary, they would use a level of force never before seen in the world. More importantly, CENTCOM signaled that it would take on a new mission. US warships would personally escort civilian oil tankers passing through the region. This meant the US Navy was assuming the role of a global maritime police force at the highest level. Aircraft carrier strike groups rapidly deployed to the region and took up positions. Advanced air defense systems formed a veritable steel shield around the strait. This massive military buildup was intended to instill confidence in panicking markets. That is why the mission in the region is not yet complete for the United States. The US military will not stop until these invisible risks in the Strait of Hormuz are eliminated. It will continue its offensive operations against Iran until land-based threats are completely eliminated. The second phase of these relentless operations serves a very clear purpose. It is entirely focused on hunting down and destroying these land-based systems. The Pentagon is monitoring the region with satellites in space and high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. It is combing Iran's coastline inch by inch and second by second. Advanced American bombers are practically raining death from the sky. They are relentlessly striking detected radar stations. Drone launch centers and underground bunkers are being wiped off the map in seconds. A full-scale operation is underway against all of Iran's military assets, capable of threatening the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, Washington's military strategy has now reached a much deeper and more ruthless dimension. It was specifically designed to completely cut off the enemy's operational lifeline. They are no longer just targeting the weapons being fired. They are also destroying the facilities that produce those weapons, command and control centers, and covert communication networks. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's latest statements are the clearest evidence of this situation. The military-level counterpart of this resolve is being clearly articulated. Hegseth states that Iran's current military capabilities have suffered massive destruction.